The sun had barely risen, casting a faint light across the small village. It was a quiet morning, but for the elder son there was no peace. His father, the pillar of their family, had passed away just 2 days ago. The weight of this loss was crushing. The grief was raw, yet something else gnawed at him: responsibility. His father had always been the one to provide, to guide, to be the strong one. Now, it was all on him. Standing by the grave, he looked at the freshly dug earth, still damp from the rain the night before. His father's absence felt like a void that could never be filled. He didn't know how to move forward. There were no answers, only questions. But the biggest one was how he was supposed to take care of everything now. His father had always kept things in order, and now he had to step up. But could he? His younger siblings seemed lost, wandering through the house, unaware of the full extent of the situation. They were too young to understand that the world had changed. They hadn't seen the late-night discussions his father had with the local farmers, or the bills that piled up unnoticed in the corner of his office. Now, all of it was his. His chest tightened with the thought of what lay ahead. His mind raced as he walked away from the grave. How would he find the strength to handle the debts, the responsibilities of the household, and the future of his family? His father had always been the one to fix things, to solve problems. Now there was no one to turn to. It was all on him, and it was too much to bear. A heavy sigh escaped his lips as he looked at the sky, the weight of grief and duty pressing down on him. What was he supposed to do now? The day felt endless. As he walked back home, he could feel the eyes of the village on him, as if they all knew the burden he carried. He was alone in this. His heart felt heavy, as though it could break under the pressure. The pain was deep, not just from losing his father, but from the realization that life would never be the same. The responsibilities, the fears, and the uncertain future were all that awaited him. But as he approached his house, a thought crossed his mind, one he hadn't considered before. What if he wasn't ready for this? What if he failed? His father had always been there to guide him, to show him the way, but now there was no one. He didn't know how to fix everything. What if he was too weak, too scared to live up to his father's legacy? The days that followed were a blur of worry and stress. His mind seemed clouded, and his once peaceful home now felt like a prison. There was so much to manage, from his father's funeral arrangements to the endless stack of bills left behind. The house felt emptier, and every corner reminded him of his father's absence. He couldn't escape the responsibility. It followed him like a shadow, creeping into every moment of his day. His mother had been silent, withdrawn since the death. She was lost in her own sorrow, unable to help him. She too had relied on his father for so long. Now she clung to memories. But memories couldn't carry the family forward. The burden of keeping their world intact lay solely on his shoulders. The weight was unbearable. He tried to focus, to figure out what to do next, but it all seemed too much. Every morning felt like a new struggle, and every evening brought a wave of regret. He had no answers, no clear path to follow. Each decision felt like a leap into the unknown, and he wasn't sure if he could handle the consequences. One evening, while trying to balance the household expenses, a sharp knock at the door broke his concentration. It was the local farmers, the same men who had always worked with his father. They wanted to speak with him about the crops, the farm's future. They had questions, expectations. He didn't know how to answer them. His father had managed these relationships so effortlessly, but he was not his father. They looked at him expectantly, as if waiting for him to say something wise, something that would make them believe he was capable. But the truth was, he didn't know. His voice faltered as he spoke, the words coming out weak, uncertain. He could feel their eyes on him, and it made him feel small. A wave of shame washed over him. He was failing. As the farmers left, they gave him a polite nod and a few parting words, but the moment they walked away, he felt even more alone. It wasn't just the burden of responsibility that haunted him now, it was the fear that he wasn't strong enough to carry it. He didn't want to disappoint his father's memory, but he feared he already had. Every decision felt like a mistake in the making. That night, as he lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, his mind raced. What had he done wrong? Why couldn't he live up to his father's legacy? Was it the pressure, or was it just him? Was he not the man he needed to be? The silence in the house was deafening. He longed for his father's voice, for his father's guidance, but all he had now were his own doubts. His thoughts kept him awake long into the night. He had no answers, only questions that seemed to multiply the more he thought about them. The fear of failure gnawed at him. What if he couldn't fix things? What if the family fell apart because he couldn't hold it together? The pressure was suffocating, and there was no one to turn to for help. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of responsibility never lifted. The family's needs were endless, and he felt himself slipping further into exhaustion. He tried to keep it together, but the cracks in his resolve were starting to show. His mother, once a source of support, now seemed lost in her grief. She no longer offered him the comfort he had hoped for. She too was drowning in the absence of his father. There was no one to lean on. One afternoon, after a long day of sorting through paperwork and trying to make sense of his father's affairs, he found himself sitting alone on the porch. The quiet was overwhelming, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full extent of his loss. His father had been his rock, the one who had always known what to do, how to handle everything. Now, that stability was gone, and the world felt unstable. He didn't know who he was without his father. As he sat there, lost in thought, his younger sister Emily came to sit beside him. She didn't speak at first, just sat quietly, her presence offering some small comfort. She too was struggling, though in a different way. She had always been close to their father, and now that he was gone, she felt adrift. "Do you think he's watching over us?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, uncertain, but full of longing. He didn't know how to answer. Part of him wanted to believe that his father was still with them, guiding them, but another part of him wondered if that was just wishful thinking. He had no way of knowing. All he knew was that his father was gone, and it was up to him now. "I don't know," he replied quietly. "I wish I could talk to him." "I miss him so much," Emily whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. He always knew how to make everything better. He reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. He didn't have the words to comfort her. He barely had the strength to comfort himself. He felt a tear slip down his cheek, a mixture of grief and guilt. How could he keep this family together when he couldn't even hold himself together? The silence between them was heavy, but there was something oddly comforting in it. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel as though he was facing everything alone. His sister's presence reminded him that they were in this together, even if they didn't know how to navigate the pain. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, he stayed up, reflecting on everything that had happened since their father's death. The grief, the fear, the uncertainty, it all felt like a storm that was never going to pass. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing, that he wasn't enough. The weight of his father's legacy pressed down on him, making every decision feel like a monumental task. As he sat alone in the dark, his thoughts turned to the future. How long could he keep pretending that everything was fine? How long before the cracks became too large to hide? He didn't have the answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. But one thing was clear. He couldn't do this alone. He needed to find a way to heal, to move forward, but he wasn't sure how. All he had now was the painful truth. His father was gone, and it was up to him to find a way forward. But deep down he wondered if he could ever be the man his father had been. As the days passed, he tried to keep up with the endless demands of his father's responsibilities. The bills piled up, the household tasks seemed to multiply, and the pressure was relentless. He had no time to grieve, no time to process the loss of the person who had always been there to guide him. It was as if his father's absence had created a void so large he couldn't fill it. He had become a shell of himself, just going through the motions, too tired to think, too lost to care. His younger brother Jake had become withdrawn, spending most of his time in his room. It pained him to see Jake like this, but he didn't know how to reach him. Their father had always been the one to encourage Jake, to show him how to navigate life. Now with their father gone, Jake had lost his anchor. Their bond had always been close, but now it felt strained. One evening, after a particularly draining day, He found Jake sitting outside, staring into the dark. There was something haunting about his brother's expression, something that spoke of deep sorrow and confusion. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but eventually walked over and sat next to him. "I don't know how to do this," Jake said softly, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to live without him." The pain in his brother's voice hit him like a punch. He had been so focused on his own struggles, on trying to keep everything together, that he hadn't stopped to consider how much this loss had affected Jake. He had always been the strong one, the one who had to shoulder the responsibility. But Jake needed him too. They needed each other, now more than ever. "I don't know how to do this either," he admitted quietly. "But we have to try. For him, Jake. He wouldn't want us to fall apart." Jake's eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The weight of their shared grief hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They were both lost, trying to find their way in a world without the man who had always been their guide. But in that moment, as they sat together in the darkness, there was a glimmer of understanding between them. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. The next morning, he awoke to the sound of Emily crying. He rushed to her side, only to find her sitting on the floor clutching a photo album of their father. The sight of it shattered him. It was a reminder of the man they had lost, the man who had been their foundation. "I don't know how to go on without him," Emily sobbed. "I don't know how to live in a world where he's not here." His heart ached for her, for the pain she was feeling. He understood it all too well. He wanted to make her feel better, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the truth was, he didn't know if it ever would be. "I don't have the answers, Emily," he said, sitting beside her and pulling her into his arms. "But I promise you, we'll get through this together. We have to." He felt the weight of his words, knowing deep down that he didn't have the strength to carry them alone. But he also knew that he couldn't give up. For his father, for his siblings, he had to keep going, even when the path ahead seemed so uncertain. Later that day, as he was sorting through his father's things, he came across a letter, one that his father had written to him just before his death. His hands trembled as he opened it, unsure of what he would find. The letter was short but heartfelt, filled with advice and love. "My dear son," the letter began, "I know the burden you will carry, and I know you will rise to it. Do not let fear or doubt guide your steps. Remember who you are and who I raised you to be. You are strong and you are capable of more than you know. Take care of your family, and remember that I am always with you." Tears welled up in his eyes as he read the words. It felt as though his father was still there, speaking to him from beyond the grave. In that moment he felt a spark of hope, a sense of purpose. He wasn't alone, and his father's words would guide him, even in his absence. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket, a reminder of the man who had shaped him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him the strength to take the next step. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least now he knew he wasn't walking it alone. As the weeks passed, life continued to weigh heavily on him. The responsibilities kept piling up, and no matter how hard he tried, it felt like there was never enough time, enough strength, or enough of him to go around. His siblings were still struggling, and he was the one who had to bear the brunt of everything. Sometimes the exhaustion felt unbearable, and the weight of it all threatened to crush him. But he kept pushing forward, because what choice did he have? One evening, after a long day of trying to manage everything, he sat down at the dinner table with his siblings. They were all there, but the silence between them was deafening. Emily looked tired, her eyes swollen from too many sleepless nights. Jake barely touched his food, his gaze distant, lost in his own thoughts. And him? He felt like a stranger in his own life, just going through the motions, pretending to have it all together when inside, he was falling apart. "We need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He knew this conversation was long overdue, but it had to happen. His family needed him, and he needed them too. Jake looked up, his expression unreadable. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still holding back tears. He could feel the weight of their sadness pressing on him, but he refused to back down. He had to be the one to bring them together. "I know things have been hard," he began, his voice faltering slightly. "But we can't keep living like this. We need to be there for each other. We need to find a way to move forward. Together. For a long moment, no one said anything. It was as if his words had fallen on deaf ears. The grief that hung over them was thick, suffocating. But then, Emily spoke, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to keep going," she said, her words breaking through the silence like a knife. "I miss him so much. Every day feels like a struggle." Her pain was so raw, so real, that it pierced his heart. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but the truth was, he didn't know. How could he promise something when he wasn't sure himself? But one thing he did know was that they couldn't continue like this, in silence, in pain. "We don't have to figure everything out right now," he said gently. "But we have to start by being there for each other. We've lost so much already, we can't afford to lose each other too." Jake finally spoke up, his voice soft but steady. "I don't know how to move on, but maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can carry him with us in everything we do." The words struck him like a bolt of lightning. Maybe moving on wasn't the answer. Maybe it was about carrying their father's legacy, his love, his lessons, with them as they faced the challenges ahead. Maybe that was the way to honor him, to keep him alive in their hearts. A tear slipped down his cheek. But this time, it wasn't out of sorrow. It was out of relief. For the first time since his father's death, he felt a glimmer of hope. His family was still here, still fighting, still holding on. That night they sat together, not in silence, but in a quiet understanding. They weren't healed, not yet, but they had made a step forward, and sometimes that's all it takes. One small step towards healing, one moment of clarity in the midst of the chaos. As he lay in bed later that night, the words from his father's letter echoed in his mind. "You are strong, and you are capable of more than you know." His father had believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Maybe, just maybe, he could find the strength to keep going. For his family. For his father. In the darkness, he whispered a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't let his father down. He wouldn't let his family down. He would keep going, one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, they would find their way out of the darkness, together. Days turned into weeks, and slowly things began to change. The pain of loss was still there, but it didn't consume him like it once did. There were still moments when it felt like the weight of his father's absence was too much to bear, but those moments were becoming fewer. He was finding his way through the darkness, one small step at a time. He took on the responsibilities of the family with a new sense of purpose, a newfound determination. The pressure didn't feel as heavy as it had before, not because it was any less, but because he had his siblings by his side. They had come together, just as their father would have wanted. They still had their struggles, but they were learning to lean on each other, to find strength in their shared grief. One afternoon, as he was going through his father's old things, he stumbled upon a box hidden at the back of the closet. It was filled with letters, old photos, and mementos. As he sifted through the box, he found something that made his heart stop, a letter from his father to him, written just before his passing. He opened it with trembling hands, his eyes welling up as he read the words. "My dear son, I know things seem impossible right now, and you may feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. But I want you to know this. You are not alone. You have the strength inside you to face whatever comes your way. Don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it, and most importantly, never forget that you are loved." The words hit him like a tidal wave. It was as if his father was still with him, guiding him, comforting him. He sat there holding the letter, allowing the tears to fall freely. In that moment he realized something. His father had never truly left. His love, his wisdom, his guidance would always be with him. And that knowledge filled him with a peace he hadn't felt in months. That evening he sat down with his siblings, the letter in his hands. He showed it to them, his voice thick with emotion as he read the words aloud. Emily and Jake listened intently, their faces softening as the words of their father filled the room. "It's like he's still here with us," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I miss him so much." "I know," he said, his voice rough, "but he's with us in here." He placed a hand over his heart. and we're going to be okay. We'll get through this together." They sat together, not just as siblings, but as a family, bound together by love and loss. The grief was still there, still a part of them, but it no longer defined them. They had learned to live with it, to find strength in each other. And they knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he felt a sense of calm that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, he felt ready to face it. He had the love of his family, the memory of his father, and the strength within him, and that was enough. He closed his eyes, a small smile tugging at his lips. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. And that, in itself, was a kind of peace.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.